My name is David. What I do is talk for a few minutes about a topic, and then we open it up. If you have questions or comments about the topic, that's great. If you want to talk about something else, that's great too. So, and I usually try to provide information about tools or some aspect of recovery. And today, in keeping with that theme, I wanted to just do some elements of a happy life. I think I was reading a couple articles this past week about the amount of stress in our society, and certainly not just addicts, but everyone in general, and the amounts of loneliness and suicide rates increasing. And it was a pretty grim set of statistics. So I think it got me thinking about, what are the elements of a happy life? And certainly before I got into recovery, I had no idea. I was certainly not happy, and I had no idea how to put it together. So this may be basic to some people, but I think it's worthy of some discussion. So this is not the definitive list. I picked 7. There's lots of them we could talk about, but I'll just go through them and talk about them a little bit, and we can see where we go. The first one I put was self-acceptance. And I think healthy people and happy people really learn to accept themselves with some high degree of unconditionalities. So when I was in my disease, and I think most addicts are just so critical, and that's really how I was taught to be. And we absorbed that starting as children, but it's so important, I think, to kind of reverse that and start to really see ourselves as valuable people, and get rid of some of the negative self-talk that we've talked about here before. I always talk about the little voice, the little bird on our shoulder, or the voice in our ear that has that critical, undermining talk, like, who do you think you are, and what an idiot, and you screwed that up again, and just this critical stuff that just reinforces that. So I think a great first step in this self-acceptance is just turning the volume down on that critical self-talk, and actually then substituting it for more positive affirmations. Core beliefs move into this area too of self-acceptance. The core beliefs that, I'm a loser, I'll never succeed in anything, I'm damaged goods, I'm a waste of time, and just all these negative core beliefs that we tell ourselves so often, they kind of fade into the background. They're almost unconscious. So we really have to become aware of that when we're doing that, and really start to practice forgiveness and self-compassion. And I think, a lot of us have a lot of trouble. We've done things in our disease that we're not proud of, that causes a lot of shame and upset. And so I think to really learn how to practice some self-compassion is really important. So self-acceptance is the first one. The second one that I still bump into many years later is high frustration tolerance. I get frustrated at myself normally, but in everything, in traffic, and not doing something fast enough, and not doing something right the first time. And I am the most unhandy person in the world. And so trying to do is this a basic something, with a tool they call a screwdriver and a screw, not rocket science. I get all frustrated, and it goes right back to like when I was 4 years old and a perfectionist of father. And, so it takes me right back there. So that frustration tolerance, what I've learned to apply is the Serenity Prayer in those situations. What can I change? What can't I change about the situation? Is something I can improve? Or is whatever is frustrating me something I have no power over, no control? If I'm at an airport waiting for a flight for 4 hours, I have no control over that. I can get really frustrated, I can get upset, and have a miserable 4 hours. Or I can look for alternatives, or ultimately just accept it. So I think that ability to slowly increase frustration tolerance, and I think it's like a muscle. You kind of practice it and you build it up. And I had just no frustration tolerance at all. I'm better in most situations. I still have my moments, but I think that ability to kind of tolerate frustration, and I would add, tolerate uncertainty. One of the hardest things for me is to not have an answer when I want it now. And this comes up sometimes with medical things where you have a test, or there's some concern, and it's going to be a week before you get the results, and I think that's where I would rather have bad news or good news. Just, I want it now. I can't, that ability to kind of sit in that gray zone of uncertainty is really hard for me. So those kind of things, just practicing that ability to sit with discomfort. The third one, self-responsibility. You know, I think it's so easy for addicts, and myself included, to kind of drop into what we call this victim triangle, right? Where we get stuck in victimhood, the aggrieved person. And we see that kind of writ large in our society right now. I think there's this culture of being a victim. So victims really, it's not just one role. They're often this three set series. The first, you just start out rescuing. You know, somebody's needy. I'm going to help you. I'm going to go out of my way. I'll give you a ride. I'll lend you money. I'll do this and that for you. And then if we don't get the proper amount of feedback, I start to feel like I've been taken advantage of. And I start to feel like I'm a victim in this. And look what he's done to me. Look at all I've done. And I don't get this or that. And then the third piece of that is what they call becoming a persecutor. It's like, well, you know, I'll show you, I won't talk to you for a year, or I'll do something passive aggressive, or something like that. So people spin around in this triangle. But the bottom line is really to take responsibility. And that includes, for me, not just, it was easier in my early recovery to take responsibility for the bad stuff I did. I think for me, responsibility means also accepting the good stuff I do, right? What are the good things I've done? What are the talents? If somebody says, you've done a great job, you know, do I say, oh no, or do I think that, or do I say thank you? You know, that responsibility for both good and bad, I think, is really important. Tolerance is the fourth one. Tolerance for other people, tolerance for myself, the ability, giving myself permission to make mistakes, to be wrong, to own it if I am, and I think just to loosen up a little bit on myself, to not have as much self-critical talk. Fifth one, flexibility. Addicts and their partners, I think, tend to be pretty rigid. And, you know, for me, my life was so out of control in my addiction that I applied real rigid standards in certain areas that I had some control over, but it was kind of ridiculous because everything was falling apart around me. So learning to be flexible, learning to kind of go with the flow, learning to understand that if I don't get something today, maybe the process is in the works to get it tomorrow. So I think just that ability to tolerate myself, tolerate myself and treat myself with compassion and kindness, treat others around me with compassion and kindness. I think sometimes it's easy, if we're not feeling good about ourselves, we project that onto other people. So we can be highly critical of people that love us, of our partners, of our children, of our friends. It all gets kind of projected outward. So I think that tolerance is a really key aspect that, if nothing else, makes life pleasant to go through. Three more, flexibility, flexible thinkers. You know, I think that really ties into that same rigidity I just spoke of, or the rules. You know, it has to be this way, or if I'm going to be happy, it's got to be A, B, C, and nothing else will do. And these are kind of faulty ways of thinking. So I think just that ability to kind of flow. You know, things don't work out the way they start. The best made plan is going to be changed no matter what. And so for me, it was all about dealing with my own anxiety. So my way of dealing with anxiety was to say, okay, this is how it's going to unfold. Step A, step B, step C. And when it didn't go that way, I'd get all kind of crazy because then my anxiety kicked in. So for me, it was a way to an inappropriate way to manage feelings, to have this kind of rigid view of stuff. So to be flexible requires a little bit of comfort with oneself, trusting the process, being able to speak up for myself, all those things that go into functioning. There's a great expression in program about, I'm not going to blow it with exact words, but basically wearing the world kind of like a loose garment, just kind of not being so tight and rigid and constricted. the sixth one really goes with the same thing, that acceptance of uncertainty and change. I was so, I desperately wanted change in my life, but I was really afraid of change as well. And so I was in this, like, I was like a double bind. I wanted it, but I was afraid of what was going to happen. So I think this acceptance of uncertainty, and that really is that the expression people talk about where the only thing that we were certain of is change, right? And that's certainly true. And for me, now I've had enough recovery to understand that the change has been almost uniformly positive. The changes in my life have been miraculous and totally unpredictable. And if I would have had the recovery that I plotted out for myself, it's far less spectacular than what actually happened. And I think that's the case that I see in my clients, and it's what I see in my friends. If we limit ourselves to what we can imagine at a certain point, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. It's just to be open to the possibility. And that was a huge leap for me. But it opens up doors and things happen. I'm a great believer in visualization, where we kind of, and there's nothing magical about it, but I think imagining, if I want, I had a client who used to dream about a Caribbean vacation, and he just put up a picture of a palm tree and a turquoise water and looked at it every day. And that didn't do anything magical to create the trip. But what it did do is that he put his attention in little ways toward that trip every day, whether he was aware of it or not. And guess what? He was in the Caribbean like a year later. So those things do happen. And the final one I want to just talk about is commitment. I think the commitment to our recovery is first and foremost, but I think commitment really, for me, reflects purpose. And I think the whole point of recovery, and one of the key elements of a good recovery, is meaning and purpose. And to me, that's commitment not only to my own sobriety, but commitment to my peers, commitment to making this world a better place, and just commitment to integrity. And all of those things were impossible to me when I was in my addiction. I was closed off to that. So a lot of stuff, I'll just go over them again, we'll open up. So I had self-acceptance. I had an ability to tolerate frustration, taking responsibility for myself, being tolerant, being flexible, accepting uncertainty and change, and finally commitment and purpose. So those are kind of some of the magic sauce for my recovery anyway, to live a happy life.
Thank you, David. Yeah, as David just said, he's talking about the elements of a happy life today. You can ask questions on that or anything else. The easiest way to do that is to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can type a question. I'll read it out. David can answer. Sometimes I chime in, sometimes I don't. On the first one, David, and you can ask questions about anything you want, so don't feel constrained by the topic. The first one, though, self-acceptance, as you were explaining it, quitting the critical self-talk and accepting ourselves as we are, for me, it's almost the opposite of addiction. Addiction is a commitment to not live in reality, and self-acceptance is a commitment to live in reality. Do you see all of these kind of as the opposite of addiction?
I think I really do, because these are all kind of mindsets and patterns and behaviors that fuel addiction and keep it in place. And I think all of these are kind of commitments to living a different life. And for me, and we've talked almost every week probably about the importance of connection and those bonds. And I think each of these really contribute to that. If I'm feeling good enough about myself to reach out to someone, that builds that social connection. If I can tolerate a different viewpoint instead of being critical or judgmental or passive aggressive, I might be open and learn to understand somebody and maybe learn something about myself. So all of these things are for kind of the opposite of the direction we want to go to when we're in our addiction, for sure. Yeah.
I guess happiness is the opposite of addiction for me anyway. I've never met a happy addict. If people had asked me when I was in my addiction, are you a happy person? I would have said yes. And then I would have thought, well, not entirely, but that's as far as I would have gone. But in retrospect, I was horribly lonely, horribly depressed, filled with anxiety, and just terrified of other people that, I don't feel those things anymore.
I think too, when we're in our addiction, it's almost physiologically impossible to, just because of the brain processes and the psychological that really almost preclude happiness or being satisfied. There's always something wrong. And just in the brain, addiction interferes with the sort of neurochemicals that allow us to really truly be happy and content. So yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's funny too. I was the same way. I think when you're in that zone, it's really hard to understand, to be objective about it. Because I would have thought I was basically happy, but looking back, I was miserable, and kind of telling myself that. And all kinds of things have changed. Things that I thought were really hysterically funny in my disease, or other people that were funny. I look back, just they're kind of nasty people in their disease that are sarcastic and, not funny. So I think everything has changed. My whole viewpoint about everything has changed.
Yeah. About 4 or 5 years into my sobriety, somebody compared my sense of humor to that of Chelsea Handler. And I was just mortified because I think she's just mean. And then I heard the things that came out of my mouth over the next couple of months. And I thought, oh, I have a character defect that I need to work on. Anyway, that's a little off topic. I wanted to talk to you, by the way, everybody, ask questions about anything. We had a couple of people show up late here. Our topic is the elements of a happy life, but anything to do with addiction and recovery, we'll answer questions on. David, the last one about commitment and purpose. This is something I talk to my sponsees about a lot. I use Joe, God, what's his name? The Spartan Games guy. He's a little crazy, but he calls it true north. Know your true north. You can't get where you're going unless you're pointed in the right direction. You may not know what the end result of it's going to be, but you need to know what direction you're going. And I think having a purpose to life, it helps with sobriety. It helps me with sobriety to know what I want to do with myself. I want to help other people. I also want to be a writer, and I get to do both, and I'm very happy about it. But it took me quite a while to get here. And David, I know you were in a completely different career when you started too.
Right. And frankly, I was adrift. I mean, I had a whole other career in anthropology and museums and field work with Native Americans, and it was a very interesting life, but it was one that I just kind of fell into, a chance happening. It's not something I set out and pursued. And consequently, I didn't know what I wanted. And it took me quite a few years in recovery, frankly, to get clear on that. And it's still kind of evolving, but I didn't even understand my purpose was to survive, to get through the day or to get my next drink or drug, really, frankly, in my addiction. It was all tied up with that. And so when I got in recovery, all that energy and focus that I put into the addictive activities was kind of available, and time was available. And I'm a gay man who went through the 80s and 90s when we lost a tremendous amount of people to HIV. And so there's this like existential crisis, like why am I here? Why did I survive? What's the point? And it was very selfish, frankly. I mean, I found that I felt better when I could apply myself and give some meaning to what I was doing. And if I could do some good in the meantime, great. But it makes me feel good. And when I talk about purpose, I don't imply that you need just one purpose. Sometimes people can have multiple purposes. And it's sometimes when I do groups, I'll ask how many people know kind of what their purpose is, what gives them meaning? And very few hands are raised. This is not something we think about consciously a lot. And I really encourage my sponsees and my clients to really think about what is their purpose? What's it all about? What are they doing here? It does help.
When people do feel like they have a purpose or a goal or a true north, whatever we want to call it, what are the barriers they run into? Especially addicts new to recovery, which I think most of our audience is tonight.
Right. So I think one is just confusion. I think sometimes we have been responding to other people's needs and ideas of what we should be doing. So there's this kind of internalized or imported expectations from other people. And often, even though we may be 40 or 50-year-old men or women, these are expectations that were put on us as children that we're still kind of going around with. I think sometimes besides the confusion, there's a lot of self-doubt and self-judgment about our abilities or what does it matter, sort of rejecting ourselves before we take a risk. I think it's getting clarity. You know, as I said, it took me years to really kind of get clear, and I was kind of fumbling along, and frankly, all I could manage was to stay sober. That was my job. That was my purpose to get into recovery, to get a solid recovery, and that took me some years. But I think once that clarity emerges, once we start to find meaning, once I start to, I was so isolated in my whole life, I think, before I got into recovery. Once I experienced how it felt to be connected to other people in a healthy way, that lit up all these circuits in my head, all these possibilities of how I might relate to other people in the world. It was an eye-opener to me that I hadn't experienced before, because all my relationships have been pretty unhealthy and not affirming, and I was really hard on myself. And so to have some healthy connections and healthy relationships really opened my eyes to the possibility of that. So I think an important first step is just to get a solid foundation in recovery, but to be thoughtful about these kinds of things, because the choices we make as addicts are not the choices we make in recovery. And so I think a lot of my life was chosen from addiction. And I had to kind of rebuild my life once I woke up in my sobriety and started to evaluate what's important to me, what's not important, why am I doing this? Why am I not doing that? And those kind of things, those questions, that were very helpful. The other thing I would say, I was open to and actually sought out kind of guidance from people or feedback, because I don't think this is a process that we can necessarily do on our own. It was helpful for me to get some interaction to talk about these things. How about you, Scott? What do you think about barriers? It's an interesting question.
Well, in the beginning for me, the worst barrier, I had two barriers. One was negative self-talk. I'm not good enough. I don't deserve this. I'm good, but I'm not good enough. All the stuff that still rattles around upstairs here. The other bit was a fear of making mistakes. What if I make the wrong decision? What if I get stuck in something I don't like? What if? I was living in the wreckage of my future.
I love that.
And most of that wreckage never, ever comes to pass. And I finally just got busy, and I did make some mistakes. My first sort of career path was writing for TV and film, and I wrote some short films and they got produced, and I did some directing and I did some editing. And the time came for me to make a decision. Do I move to LA or do I stay where I am? And I realized I don't want to work in this industry. It's mean and nasty and cutthroat, and it's not good for my sobriety, and I don't want to do it. So I backed away and just kind of existed for a little while, and figured out what I wanted to do next. And I started taking on sponsees at that point, and I realized I like working with people. I like helping people. I got a job running a sober house for a while, and that kind of led into hooking up with Dr. Weiss and seeking integrity, eventually seeking integrity. But I made mistakes, and it was okay. One of the things you talked about was tolerance for not only others but for myself.
Yeah.
And I've had to learn how to tolerate being me, because me is not perfect. By the way, people, this is your webinar, not David's and mine. We're here.
Yeah, please comment even on your experience with these or anything.
But in the interim, I wanted to, I'll go back through these real quick for the people who joined us late. Elements of a happy life: self-acceptance, ability to tolerate frustration, self-responsibility, not being a victim, accept the good things in your life, tolerance for self and others, flexibility, acceptance of uncertainty and change, which I think is a big one for me too, and having commitment or a purpose. These are all internal fixes for an internal problem. And I just kind of wanted to point out to everybody that addiction is an external fix for the same problems. And that's why it stops working, because it's not from within. So the problems just stay there and fester and get worse. At least they did for me.
And, we did some work on the unit today about triggers, and, all of these things, when they're not working well, can be a trigger. And triggers for addicts create, their emotions or uncomfortable feelings that cause the urge to self-medicate, whether it's through sexual acting out or drugs or any kind of addictive behavior, to numb, dissociate, to float away from these problems, to distance ourselves. And so, yeah, it's a really good point that these are internal problems and internal fixes, and which really are the hardest ones, right? Because they take, first of all, I lived with my addict self for almost 30 years. And so that was really entrenched, and I had to believe that I could change and want to change. And then all these barriers that, the self-criticism, all this stuff really could get in the way of my recovery. And I think that's the reason I wanted to bring it up today, because I had to overcome each one of these in my recovery journey. And it's not like, check that one off, we're good to go. These things pop up over and over again, right? Just now they're like old friends. I know them, and I can say, oh yeah, you again, and can deal with it. But it was a learning experience to learn how to deal with this. I'm really curious if anybody has experience with these, if you're struggling with any of these, or feel free to jump in. It's an exceedingly quiet group tonight.
There's plenty of people here, so there we go. Somebody hopped in here. This is from our treatment house. Hello, guys. You'll see me tomorrow in person. When I feel my intense emotional triggers, what is the best way to manage them quickly to avoid succumbing to a slip or relapse? Good question.
Yeah, great question. So these intense emotional triggers are, highly activating, and they come out of nowhere. And as I mentioned to the guys today, we are going to be triggered. It's not trigger. We don't have control over triggers. They're going to happen. And so it's not really productive to feel shame or to judge ourselves, or we get triggered. It's what we do with them that really is what counts. And so my responsibility as a recovering addict, when I get triggered, is to manage them, which goes directly to your question, which is a great question. What I do, if I keep it to myself, it kind of bubbles around and I start to stumble. So I really try to give it away. I try to share with somebody, and if it's serious enough, I'll drop what I'm doing and get on the phone and call someone. Because I think it's really important to make that human connection with someone, to express it, to give it away, to externalize it out of me. if I can't get hold of somebody, I have lots of tools, kind of emotional grounding tools. I will close my eyes and picture grounding cords. I do a lot of meditation with visuals and grounding cords coming out of my feet into the earth and anchoring me and, feeling safe and grounded. Or I have a safe place in my head where I go and imagine it. I have anchors. I have all these kind of grounding tools, breathing. Things to dissipate the intensity of it. And then if nothing else, I'll distract myself. And that I can do that by standing up, moving out, going outside. I like to go out and kind of make contact with the sky, or I'll pet my dogs, or play the piano for a minute, or do something just to get my brain in a different gear. So I think, so manage it as best you can, talk about it, or worst comes to worst, distract yourself to get away from it.
Yeah, in early recovery for me, I did, always the best tool for me has been to talk to somebody about it. But especially in early recovery, I wasn't always willing to pick up the phone or tell the person sitting next to me. So I had some other tools. I had a rubber band around my wrist, and I would snap it just to jolt my head out of it for half a second. My wrist was always just bright red from all the rubber band snapping. There are variations of what Dr. Rob calls the 3-second rule. You get triggered, you ask your higher power to take that away. That was the most effective tool for me in early recovery, even though I did not have a higher power. The simple act of changing my thought process to please take this away from me actually helped me change my thought process. Now, 30 seconds later, I might have to do that again. But what I learned was I didn't have to act on triggers. I could, one moment at a time, I could not act on my triggers. Nowadays, I've started doing breath work recently, courtesy of David, who talks about breath work, and I find that it works. Maybe I'll let David explain that in a second. The big thing that has worked for me for most of my sobriety, and which is quite a number of years now, is I go to the outer circle of my sexual boundary plan, and it lists all the things that I like to do instead of my addiction. David used the word distraction. I like to think of it as doing something that's not my addiction. Play with the cat, make some dinner, go to a movie, read a book, whatever. Anything else. And there's 100 different things. And this question came from the treatment center, so you're likely to do the circle plan while you're there. At least I hope so. And if not, you'll do it in your 12-step program when you get out. So, the circle plan, for people who don't know what that is, the inner circle is your bottom line behaviors that you need to stay away from. The middle circle is your slippery situations, people, places, things, and emotions. And then the outer circle is stuff to do instead of your addiction, because addictions take a lot of time, and suddenly we have all this free time, and we get triggered. So, you want to explain breath work real quick?
Yes, I will. I just want to add, before I do that, just another tool is just being mindful, just noticing, and without judging. So, I'm being triggered. What just happened? I just saw that person. What feeling's going on? Just being aware of it, and without judgment, without shame, reporting like a good reporter. And that also can kind of get you out of the emotional cycle into more of an observer role. That helps break it a little bit. I'm not sure which breath work you're talking about. I do a lot of, there's two things I'll talk about. Breathing exercises, which as a therapist, we can do really important physiologically changing breathing patterns. So one I like was developed by Andrew Weil. It's 4-7-8, which simply means inhaling for the count of 4, holding it for a count of 7, exhaling it for a count of 8. So inhale 4, hold 7, exhale 8. And generally they talk about doing 4 cycles of that. And by the way, if you haven't practiced it, it's really hard because you have to kind of gauge how much air you take in and how long you hold it. And but you get better with it. But even just 4 cycles will kind of reset your physiology. It can break some anxiety. It can calm. You can do it at a stoplight, or nobody really knows you're doing it. You can do it. It's very discreet. So that's one thing. Breath work, there's another kind of breath work that's a little more intense called holotropic breathwork, where that's a practitioner thing. Really needs to be supervised, but I do that as well, where you basically breathe in and out on your back. You lie on your back, you have an observer, and you kind of go into this altered state. We do it for 90 minutes at a time where I do it. And it's a great trauma therapy. It's not a cognitive process. You don't have thoughts. You just have experiences. Sometimes great, sometimes not great, but it's a way of releasing body trauma. But that requires some supervision. But the 4-7-8 breathing, there's other patterns with different numbers, sets, but that kind of stuff is really worthwhile. Have you found it helpful, Scott?
Yeah, I've been using the 4-7-8, and it just works wonders for me.
Yeah.
Whenever I have a lot of anxiety, and it really helps me with that. And it also just helps me if I want to change what I'm thinking. It's convenient, it's easy, it doesn't require other people. I can do it anywhere, right. And it works for me.
And I found it's really useful. I'm a great believer in distraction, right? If I'm focused on something, despite all the modern literature, we can't multitask. We just do what's called rapid switching. We can go between tasks really fast, but nobody can think about 2 things at once. And so if I'm focusing on counting to 4 and holding my breath, and suddenly my mind is focusing on that and has released whatever it was worried about. So it does help.
Yeah, I think the 4-7-8 works on a physiological level and this distraction level. I think that's why I find it so effective.
Right, good.
So I'm going to skip question 2 and go to question 3, and then we'll go back to number 2. Is there ever a positive trigger, something that may encourage positive actions, such as participating in an outer circle activity or recovery? And should I pay attention to these to encourage my recovery the same as I do negative or acting out triggers?
That's a great question. I think in addiction language, we think of triggers as something related to the start of an addictive cycle, or something that feeds our addiction or cues us for addictive behavior. I would think in my recovery, I'm not sure I'd call them triggers, but I certainly get cues for healthy behavior. And it's funny because I don't think of it as triggers like I did for addiction, but it's almost instinct or reflex, or I kind of have a sense of to do the right thing or to make a choice or to take action in a positive way. And so I probably always had that, but I never paid attention to those before. It's subtle. I think triggers for me were kind of in your face, really high-powered addictive risk. The recovery trigger, the positive triggers, if you want to call it that, for me are more subtle. Knowing, it's that discernment, knowing what I should do, being aware of it, having a sense that, and sometimes it'll just pop into my head, I need a walk. I need to go out and take a walk for 10 minutes. Okay, I'll do that. So sometimes those are triggers, I guess. And at some level, I think my body knows what it needs. My mind knows what it needs. But I have to think about that. That's an interesting idea, because I always just think of triggers as something negative. But I certainly do get cued in my life to do things in my outer circle, if you will, and to do good and healthy things. So, yeah. But I would focus, as human beings, we have this tendency to look for the negative, right? We're kind of hardwired. It helps us protect us. We scan the environment for negative stuff. And so I think we tend to notice the negative triggers and the negative ideas that float around us in the world. It really takes practice, at least for me. It took practice to notice the good stuff, to notice positive things, to be aware of those things. And so it almost was creating new habits to live by in a positive way, with some of the things we were talking about today in terms of how to be happy. So I would say most of the time when I'm doing those elements that we put in the outer circle, the outer boundary, the things that are good for me, that is really kind of a conscious choice to do that as opposed to being triggered to do that. But I guess however you get there, if you do those activities, that's a good thing. Scott, do you have positive triggers? What do you think?
Well, I was just thinking it's kind of interesting that some of the things that used to be negative triggers that would set me off a little bit now are positive triggers. If I was out at a restaurant and there was a family at the next table and they were laughing and having fun, that used to annoy me because I wasn't having fun and they were interrupting my alcohol and food orgy. And, now I see that and I remember how much fun I had sometimes as a kid when my family would go out to eat. And I think, isn't that nice that they're enjoying themselves? And it makes me want to have a good day. Or sometimes in recovery, I'll hear about somebody doing something positive for themselves or someone else in their recovery. And it triggers me to remember how good I feel when I do those things. So there are some positive triggers, but yeah, David's right. I mean, even now, my brain is much more likely to notice negative than positive. I'm wired that way. I have PTSD. It is what it is. And I just had to learn how to deal with it over the years. But yeah, in early recovery, pay attention to the positive stuff, but pay more attention to the negative stuff because that's what's going to drive you back out.
And learn to manage it. I think that's the key. It's just to learn how to deal with it. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump back up to the question I skipped for a minute. It's in reference to the things we talked about, negative self-talk, being a victim, things like that. This individual wants to know what kind of practices, actions can we do to overcome what you're talking about? I think we talked about some of it, but maybe go back through some of that.
Yeah, I guess in general, I would say to kind of bring this into consciousness. I think a lot of the negative stuff that keeps our addiction locked in place is not even conscious thought. It's kind of habit. It's automatic thoughts. It's negative self-talk it's kind of generated and churns and is spinning around in our head. And so I think really an essential beginning is to start to get some awareness of that, to start to be aware of that, how hard I am maybe about something, or the self-critical, or the perfectionism, or the intolerance of making a mistake. Just kind of starting to notice that and consciously try to change it. So I think there's this idea of consciousness as a really important starting point. Not even starting point, it's important all the way through to just be aware of this stuff. And because if you're not aware you're doing it, you're not going to be able to change it. And then once you sort of identify things that you do want to change or to create new habits, it really just takes practice and kind of rewiring the brain. We all put a lot of effort into our addiction, and think of the years and the money and the intensity and the concentration and the effort and the interest that we gave it. And all that has really hardwired a lot of those addictive processes into our brain, and those need to be changed. And that takes time and patience and persistence. So I would really start to root out what you see as some of the negative aspects or things you'd like to change. And as we've talked about in this webinar before, it's not psychologically sound to say, don't do this or don't do that. Just because the way our brain's wired, it doesn't understand the negative. So if I say don't smoke, what we're really left with is smoking. And so we're still thinking about smoking, even though we're saying don't do it. So we replace it with something positive. Instead of saying don't smoke, say go learn to run, take a walk in nature, do some breathing, do something positive. So I think to replace those, not just with a stern message to yourself not to do it, but to really figure out what's a healthy alternative that I can plug into that spot and practice that in a conscious way. So it's just swapping them out, like taking a negative part out and sticking in a new one and getting it integrated so it's seamless and natural.
Yeah, I would want to maybe add two things. Number one, I find that I'm a big believer in gratitude lists. I bring it up probably every session. And all of the things that David went through, gratitude lists help me to change my thinking about those. In terms of awareness, you know, the middle steps of the 12 steps, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know, becoming aware of our character defects, working on them, it's a lifelong process. And I find that, and these would all, you know, negative self-talk is a character defect for me. I become aware of it, usually through an incident or someone says something to me or whatever. And then in my, I do kind of a conscious contact every morning where I do a gratitude list. And I also say, you know, I ask my higher power to help me with my character defects. And the one I'm working on most today is, and then it raises, I think that action raises my awareness of what I want to work on today. And usually it goes on for several weeks, and then that one kind of abates and something else pops up that I want to work on. Recovery is funny that way. Whatever you're ready to work on will come to the forefront, at least for me. So.
Yeah, if you don't notice it at first, it'll keep coming back, right? Those things, there it is. And I just want to endorse too, the idea of gratitude is just an amazing tool that often, I'm better now, but early on when I needed most to practice gratitude, it was the hardest. I just didn't want to, I was reluctant, I resisted. But if you can do it, gratitude is this amazing, I call it an antitoxin. It kind of goes, I can't even explain how it works, but if I can just list a few things that I'm grateful for, it can totally reverse a mood for me and get me out of the doldrums and just, it's an amazing tool. And I think it's something especially newcomers are reluctant to do because they're not feeling very grateful. But boy, is it powerful. It's like I would say it's like one of the most powerful tools in the arsenal here for an addict is to really practice gratitude on a daily basis. And not just to do, you know, when you're trying to use it or inconsistent, but I like what Scott said of daily rituals, and doing this consistently every day is hugely important because it also trains us how to do it, and you start to get some depth. And I will say too about daily rituals, I been doing a lot of traveling this year, so I'm kind of all over the place and in different hotel rooms, and it could be very kind of unnerving and unsettling, but I have daily rituals that I take with me, and they're you know, a reading, a prayer, a little meditation, that kind of thing for 10 minutes in the morning. But it doesn't matter if I'm in California or home in Florida or in Europe or wherever I am, if I do the same thing, suddenly my day is grounded and I feel like, okay, I'm here, I'm not kind of at odds. It really helps me focus and be present. So,
yeah, it goes a little bit to what you were talking about. We can't really multitask. If we're busy being grateful, we're not busy being unhappy. Brene Brown says you can't be grateful and unhappy at the same time. It's impossible.
Right.
He's right.
Right.
Okay, a couple more questions here. What are things to look for in looking back at a lapse or relapse to learn how to manage triggers better? Is it a good thing to do an autopsy of a relapse?
Yeah, so absolutely. You know, we spoke today about the acting out step in the addictive cycle really is well down. It's like the fourth or fifth one out of, you know, 5 or 6. So acting out is something I think we think of as the addiction problem, but really the acting out is just the final step of a whole series of steps that start with triggers and go through fantasies and rituals and all these other steps that go in between. So I think it's really important to go back and trace them out. And when I've done that with clients, there may be a behavior today, and we start working backwards, and it can go back weeks to the point where some decision was made. And it could be seemingly innocent, contact someone or setting up a coffee date with somebody that kind of turns negative or is triggering, or just one series of events after another. And suddenly we're kind of on a slippery slope. So I think those autopsies are really, really important. Now, I would say in early recovery, especially because a lot of this material is triggering, right? And it's really important to sometimes do that with somebody else. First of all, because we don't have good objectivity sometimes about that stuff. We don't see the patterns, but I can be blind to a pattern, but I can describe it to Scott, and he might be able to say, wait a minute, this is what I see. It's like, oh yeah, I didn't see that. So I think it's helpful to have another person as part of that process, but also to be mindful that these are triggering things. And so I never start a process like that without really consciously grounding myself. Some of the things we're talking about, that safe place or grounding cores or a couple deep breaths and being really settled. Because when we're doing that kind of work, we're really diving into the nuts and bolts of our addiction and the addictive process. And that's powerful stuff. But I think it's absolutely critical, because what we can, with relapse prevention planning, the idea is to be able to predict high-risk situations and create a plan in advance, so you don't have to create it on the spot. And by doing those autopsies, it really helps us personalize what the patterns are for us. What are my high-risk situations? Mine may be different than Scott's or someone else. And so to really get familiar with those is really important. So yeah, I would really endorse that. And then also the more you know about your triggers and your particular patterns, the better equipped you'll be to manage it. You won't be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, to use the language that I hear in AA out here, you have to go back and identify when the stinking thinking started. When I work with sponsees, I think every time we've ever done an autopsy on a relapse, the critical moment was, I didn't tell anyone about blah, 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 blah. It started before that. Somebody said something to them and that made them angry, and they didn't tell anybody. They kept it a secret. That's the critical moment, I think. When I do the autopsy with them, every time they kept a secret about something, and it got them. So yeah, I love the autopsy. One last question here. Even though I can be relatively self-aware, I don't always act accordingly. You're a human being. Self-awareness is one thing, but having the will to listen and act on what that reveals is another. That is challenging for me. How can we act in accordance with what self-awareness reveals?
That's a great question. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We can have awareness, but we have many clients who come through who have been in numerous treatments and could run the program, could teach the program, but they're not able to stay absent. And so I think there is this piece about the information, the awareness is one thing, but it's not the whole package. And so I guess the element there is willingness, and willingness to make a change, willingness to do what I have to do. And I think what I always try to do, in that situation, I think of it as there's invisible forces at work, right? There may be perfectionism, there may be fear of failure, there may be ways of thinking about ourselves that are keeping us kind of locked in from moving forward. So we can be very well equipped with information, we can have a lot of insight, but I think that willingness to act on it, and also the willingness to look at what's kind of holding us back from going forward. When we now have the information, we know better. So why aren't we doing it? And that usually goes to some kind of emotional content, whether it's fear, worry, anger, being hurt, being afraid, being perfectionistic. There's old thoughts there at work. And I think it's a matter of rooting out some of those old negative core beliefs and changing them. But I think that's an example of these strands of core beliefs that are like software that kind of operate in the background. We're not even conscious of them, but we've been taught them early on, and they do affect behavior. So it's a really good insight. But I would really look at what are some of the invisible forces kind of keeping you locked in there, and they often have to do with negative or irrational beliefs, like about oneself, or feelings, really strong feelings that are keeping you kind of locked in.
Yeah, willingness is a tough nut. I have a good friend who will look at me and say, "Are you willing to be willing?" And it's like, and I've had to learn sometimes when I don't have the willingness to pray for the willingness to be willing. Early this year, I had some old, like literally 35-year-old resentments from high school that I wanted to get rid of. And boy, I just wasn't willing. I loved those resentments and hated the people I held them against. And, I spent 2 weeks praying for the willingness to be willing to do what I needed to do to release the resentments. And that finally came, whether it's through repetition as a mantra or, some higher power up there said, okay, fine. And then I was able to release those resentments, and I'm so glad. I feel so much better. I would take those things out and play with them like every day. Just like fondle them and, my precious golem. So anyway, it's 6 o'clock. You want to wrap us up, David?
Yeah, just, we've been talking about elements of happy life. I think it's up to us to choose it. It's not going to fall into our laps. We have to choose to be happy and create it. And these are some of the steps I've done, but I think it's not something that's just going to fall into our laps. I think it's something we have to really choose to consciously pursue. And it's there. All we have to do is reach out for it, no matter what our circumstances.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We will be back next Wednesday, same time. The guys at the treatment center, I'll be in town tomorrow. You'll meet me in person.
Cool.
There already, so I'm looking forward to meeting you guys. And we'll see everybody next week.
All right, Scott. Take care. See you tomorrow. Bye.